and I'm really happy to be exploring this topic with you. I first came upon meditation in 1974 as a much younger person, and initially I didn't understand it deeply, but I recognized very quickly that there was something real there, that the simple practice of coming into the present and staying there, letting the body calm down, letting the mind get a little quieter, finding something simple such as the feeling of breathing to rest my awareness upon, that had a dramatic effect, even within just minutes. And then more broadly and more generally, as I continued to practice over time, eventually with some better training and knowledge about what I was doing, I began to experience the accumulating benefits of that particular practice, which, as we now understand with the new knowledge about the brain, must involve some kind of lasting change in the brain if we're to have a lasting change in the mind. So that's what I plan to explore with you. This topic here is one that speaks to broader issues or broader topics about any kind of deliberate mental practice, such as cultivating compassion or gratitude or insight. Also, this topic relates to the broad process of development, any kind of development, such as becoming more resilient, healing from trauma, acquiring interpersonal skills, or over time, feeling less anxious. I'll focus on meditation and related methods such as mindfulness within a secular framework. And you can certainly apply many, if not all, actually, of the points we'll be exploring and the ideas here and some of the wonderful possibilities to spiritual and religious practice. I won't mention references. I'll be covering a lot of ground. And if you want to see the references, I encourage you to take a look at my book, Neurodharma. So let's get into it. About meditation itself. There are many kinds of meditation, and researchers have mainly studied what's called focused awareness practices, or focused attention practices, rather, or open awareness. Focused attention is when we deliberately try to stay very absorbed in one particular object of attention, such as the sensations of breathing, even very focused, like breathing at the upper lip. Open awareness is one in which a person establishes a basic stability of presence in the present while letting the stream of consciousness just roll on by. And these two different kinds of meditations do sort of blur together over time in the sense that as one rests increasingly in open awareness, that becomes the object of focused attention. And even as one also goes deep into some object of absorption, such as the feeling of breathing, there can be a sense of being utterly absorbed in that object with simultaneously a tremendous sense of openness and spaciousness, and to some extent even abiding as the awareness of that particular object. This said, there are some distinctions, and as a rule of thumb, I find it often better to train initially in focused attention to stabilize our attention and then move into open awareness practices, including very, very subtle ones, such as abiding as awareness itself. Various practices can have things in common, as I've said. There are things in common with focused attention and open awareness, such as the intention to meditate. Still, different kinds of practices can have different kinds of results, especially over time. And just as a practical matter, many people will explore multiple practices over time and even integrate them in a single meditative session. I've known teachers of mine who start with a few minutes of loving kindness, compassion practice to warm their heart, and then shift into focused attention of something like breathing for 20 minutes in a row. And then as their sense of concentration and quiet and stability deepens, they move more into a choiceless kind of awareness. And of course, the most important meditation to do is the one you'll actually do. And the one you'll actually do is the one that tends to bear fruit for you over time, as well as has a certain juiciness and value for you in the moment of doing it. I don't think there's a right form of meditation, certainly not for everyone. The right form of meditation for you is the one that you'll do and has value for you and speaks to your heart. Even regular meditation is just a small part of a person's day. If you imagine someone meditating maybe for half an hour a day and they're awake for 16 hours, that's 1/32 of their entire day. So it's valuable when meditation and meditative related activities and experiences, the methods you use during meditation and what you feel in meditation, get extended into everyday life, such as bringing compassion and kindness into everyday life, or letting go of stressful striving as you move through your day, even while getting things done, and recognizing, certainly from time to time, the impermanence of all experiences and even most worldly phenomena. Meditation itself and related factors such as mindfulness have been used in healthcare, education, and consulting and counseling, as well as in business consulting. For example, here are some mindfulness-based interventions. They have these different acronyms, usually starting with MB: mindfulness-based stress reaction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based art therapy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is just a partial listing, by the way, as of 2020. There are also psychotherapies with significant mindfulness components, such as acceptance and commitment therapy or dialectical behavior therapy, and certainly compassion-focused therapy as well. And there are numerous programs, numerous trainings, such as mindful self-compassion, that have a very strong mindfulness element. Mindfulness is really spread out, hasn't it, in many kinds of ways. Mindfulness-based interventions have been used in medical care to help people reduce certain medical conditions or to reduce the suffering that comes with certain medical conditions, or enable them to better tolerate certain kinds of treatment, such as chemotherapy, that can feel very stressful. So you can see here a partial listing of some of the medical conditions that meditation or mindfulness have been found to have some kind of research evidence-based benefit for. Pretty good. Also, mindfulness interventions have been used for psychological conditions or to treat different kinds of conditions or enable people to get more out of the treatment that they're getting, such as for anxiety, depression, drug abuse and dependence, even schizophrenia, and even suicidality. It's not that mindfulness or meditation is a substitute for a reasonable standard of care for physical or mental health conditions. Very important point. It's not a substitute for reasonable care. On the other hand, it can really augment and aid, well understood and effective, generally effective medical or psychological interventions. It's interesting that in the language of science that investigates how useful something is, what is its effect size? What are the size of the effects, in other words, that it has? Generally speaking, while it can be fairly easy to get statistically significant differences related to an intervention if your study has enough subjects and the instruments you're using are sufficiently subtle. On the whole, though, effect sizes really are the indicator of how effective something is in real-world terms. And mindfulness and meditation have shown really substantial and durable effect sizes, generally speaking, including compared to other kinds of treatments for physical and mental health conditions. Here's an important point and a controversial one, I don't think my point's controversial, but it speaks to some controversies. Mindfulness in particular is not the property of any particular tradition. Kindergarten teachers who encourage their students to pay attention are teaching some kind of mindfulness. That said, mindfulness was especially developed in the early Buddhist tradition, originating 2,500 years ago, drawing upon what was available in the Buddha's own time. But still, mindfulness is a central part of the Buddhist tradition of contemplative practice and the related ideas and methods there. And so when mindfulness is extracted from a broader tradition, there's some questions about that. And I think it's important to take care in two forms, or in two ways in particular. First, let's make sure that our methods are being used for good purposes. If, for example, mindfulness training is used to enable people to be more effective snipers, I think the Buddha would be horrified, frankly, at its uses in that way. So it's also important, I think, that if mindfulness is used in corporate settings, it's not just a way to patch people up and then shove them back out onto the stressful battlefield of their, crazy workday. I think it's also important, in other words, that mindfulness itself is morally neutral. It's not inherently good or bad. So it's important to add the moral dimension or the values-related dimension in terms of how we're going to use mindfulness. Also, I think it's important to be clear that when we extract some idea or method from its larger context, we don't presume that it somehow, like a hologram, contains the entirety of that tradition. It can't possibly do that. It would be like, to use a different kind of example, taking the teaching in Christianity of turning the other cheek when people aggress upon you, and somehow saying that that's the whole of Christianity. Mindfulness is obviously not the whole of the Buddhist tradition. Just to make a simple point here, in the path of practice laid out by the Buddha, which has 8 elements to it, the Eightfold Path in the Fourth Noble Truth, right mindfulness or wise mindfulness is just one of 8 elements. It's an eightfold path, not the onefold path. Okay, all this said, let's keep going. Whoops, here we go. A caution about meditation, especially in intensive settings like retreats, and especially for more vulnerable people. Deep, sustained meditative practice can stir stuff up. So the painful, upsetting experiences, such as past trauma. It can also lead some people who are vulnerable into a dissociative sense of being very, very groundless in problematic ways, even leading to a psychotic break. There are examples of this. It's important to pay attention to it. And the people who are particularly vulnerable include those who have a history of psychosis, schizophrenia, or manic episodes, because sometimes the positive emotional experiences that can occur, especially in deep concentration practice, can foster a manic episode. Also, people are vulnerable who lack certain just normal range resources, such as self-calming, self-soothing, capacity to tolerate distressful experiences without being completely hijacked and overwhelmed by them, lacking a certain amount of psychological resources. Also, people who are prone to dissociation, spacing out, sometimes because of a history of trauma, and people who have a hard time disengaging from rumination, especially critical, self-critical rumination. People who get caught up in, I had a good meditation yesterday. Why can't I have a good meditation today? I'm a horrible yogi. Everybody around me sitting so quietly and blissfully. They're having a wonderful experience. Not, but, getting preoccupied with yourself, that can be a caution here. This said, as long as those who do have these vulnerabilities are cautious about intensive retreat practice and talk about this with experienced teachers, and as long as there are some reasonable screenings going on for people coming into retreats, the evidence shows that certainly most people can do retreat practice with significant benefits, and certainly most people, really most people, can do some kind of regular home practice, 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes a day, without worrying too much about any kind of significant negative effects. Okay, now on to some deeper questions about how does meditation change your brain. During meditation, there certainly can be beneficial experiences, such as relaxation and open-heartedness. That's good. And with repetition, beneficial states can foster beneficial traits, which are enduring personal qualities, such as greater resilience or greater compassion as a trait. I've spoken about this broad process whereby the repetition of experiences leaves lasting traces behind in terms of changes in neural function in the companion video with this particular one on the connection between the mind and the brain. And you might want to take a look at that other video program as a kind of a context or foundation for what I'm talking about here. So we have this movement from states to traits, from experiencing to learning. That's a possibility for us. Of course, any kind of lasting change of the mind must involve a lasting change in the brain. How can we use meditation to change the brain for the better? And what does the research say about that? That's what I'd like to talk about now. Well, studies have explored the brain-changing effects of meditation and mindfulness training in general. And these are lasting changes, as I've said, in neural structure and function. This is a complex and growing research literature. I get a monthly newsletter from the American Mindfulness Research Association, which is a wonderful organization to support if you like. And every month it just lists all kinds of new studies on mindfulness, many of which involve underlying neural correlates. There's a lot going on here. So I'm going to offer a summary that is selective and not comprehensive and, kind of is pretty tight. And I will, kind of mush together and refer to different kinds of meditation and different kinds of mindfulness practices in this broad summary of how meditation and mindfulness can potentially change your brain for the better. Here we go. So, after just a few days, 3 days or so of meditative training, studies have found that regions in the prefrontal cortex, right behind the forehead, exert more control over the posterior, just means rearward, cingulate cortex. Technically, by the way, there are two posterior cingulate cortices and cingulate cortices in general, one on each side of the forehead. There's two of most everything in the brain above the brainstem. It's a little bit like Noah's Ark, where the animals came in pairs. Cingulate cortices come in pairs, amygdalae come in pairs, and so forth. But I'll tend to speak of them in the singular, as is the convention in neuroscience. Now, the PCC, posterior cingulate cortex, is a key part of the default mode network, sometimes called the intrinsic network. This is a part of the brain, this network in the midline toward the rear and then spreading somewhat to the sides, that is involved with mind wandering. You're just sort of spacing out, thinking about this and that, a business meeting, you're supposed to be paying attention, but your mind's wandering. It's also involved, the default mode network, with negative rumination. Why'd they say that to me? And why doesn't anyone like me? And why do I always get it wrong? And over and over and over again. Not good, not good, not good, right? So the benefit here is that greater control by the prefrontal cortex over the default mode network means more present moment awareness, because the default mode network, kind of by definition, leaves the present, often into the future or the past. So better control over the default mode network means more present moment awareness, more being here now with less negative self-referential preoccupation. That's good, just after a few days training. And then, after a couple of months of training, often used with studies on mindfulness-based stress reduction as a program or something fairly similar to it, which tends to go over about 8 weeks, people who've done these trainings tend to have some really striking results, 3 major results. One is that prefrontal regions, again, behind the forehead, the seat of executive top-down control in the brain, have greater regulation of the amygdala. Then again, there are 2 of them, 2 amygdalae. This is important because this little almond-shaped region, the amygdala, monitors experiences for personal relevance, their salience, especially if they're unpleasant or potentially unpleasant, threatening. And then if the amygdala encounters something that seems threatening, it initiates, like an alarm bell, the neurohormonal stress response. So, greater regulation of the amygdala tends to make people more resilient and less emotionally reactive and more able to manage their emotional reactions without being tipped over by them, without being swamped by the waves of emotional reactivity. That's good. Second major benefit is that tissue gets added, actually, to the hippocampus. That's a nearby part of the brain, two of them as well, that regulates the amygdala. The hippocampus also helps put things in context. It helps us learn from our experiences too, so it's an important part of the brain in that regard as well. And the hippocampus signals the hypothalamus, we have enough stress hormones already. No more stress hormones, please. We got enough cortisol already. And there are other stress hormones as well. Well, this means that when we meditate and people train in mindfulness in this way, we're more able to have a better amygdala, in effect, in functional terms, and therefore we're more able to be resilient and more even-keeled, and we're less reactive, when we're challenged. People become more resilient in this way as well. There's a third major benefit, too, from just a couple of months of training. And I want to show you a MRI image in a moment of what this is. So the midline of our cortex is very involved with what's called mental time travel. Imagining a future and sometimes evaluating different options, like, what would I like more tonight? Chinese food or Italian food? Or, how would it go better with my boss when I talk with her if I say this or that, right? Also, mental time travel involves the past, reflecting on the past, sometimes in productive ways, but often, regretting things that have happened or rehashing conversations with people over and over again. Midline cortex. The frontal portions tend to be more task-oriented, specific, getting the job done of one kind or another, while the rearward portions are more involved in, as I've said, the default mode network. Okay, when we move into mindful, present moment awareness with less sense of self, because the sense of self, by the way, is very supported by midline activity here. This is not the only part of the brain that supports the sense of me, myself, and I, my precious, but it's certainly very involved with that. So when people go into mindful present moment awareness with things as they are, just accepting them, staying with the flow of experience, with less sense of self, when that happens, activity in the midline cortices decreases, and activity in networks on the right side of the brain, the right hemisphere, for most people, this is switched for many left-handed people, but the point is the same, lateral networks on the sides of the brain get more active. This gets quieter and connected like a seesaw, this gets more active. As one goes up, the lateral activation goes up, midline activation goes down. And that helps us come into the present. Relax the sense of self, disengage from stressful doing in terms of the midline cortex, and come more into a sense of being. It's interesting, isn't it, that if we're fixated on doing, and this is something I know well from my personal experience, getting fixated on getting stuff done, it's hard to bring in a sense of being. On the other hand, if we've established a very stable, foundational, embodied sense of being, inside that foundation, inside that frame, we can get a lot of things done. With training, neurologically, people become more able to stabilize this shift from the midline to the lateral mode and stay there. Now, both ways of operating in life are, of course, useful. There's a place for getting things done. There's a place for just sort of daydreaming and spacing out and kind of clearing your head of a lot of stuff. There's also a place, certainly, for being able to come into present moment awareness with a strong sense of being and with it, a feeling of peacefulness. We need both things. On the other hand, much of life is a very intensive training in doing and other forms of midline activity, including through consuming media and other forms of entertainment. So, since neurons that fire together wire together, if we're clocking a lot of time in midline type activities, well, guess what? We're going to be building up neural structures there and increasing neural function in the midline, which then can take over in a certain way and dominate our stream of consciousness. So for many people, me included, it's really useful to train in this capacity to shift more into the lateral mode. And takeaway point, neuroimaging studies have shown that when people do this, when they do this kind of training regularly, even over just a couple of months period, they can stabilize lateral mode activation more in terms of the neural networks that support it. And you can see the image here in a groundbreaking study from Norm Farb and his colleagues. The blue blobs have to do with midline activation that is self-referential. What's something got to do with me? Me. On the other hand, the red blobs, which you can see are distributed more on the side of the brain, and actually that's right-sided because neuroimaging pictures from your perspective are shot this way. So what would look like on the left from your perspective in a neuroimage would actually be the right side of my own brain. So that blob there in the left side of the image actually is in the right side of the brains of the subjects in this study. And the detail here is not so important, but what is important is the idea that with training, people who repeatedly practice mindfulness, even over just a couple of months, have more stable activation of those lateral networks, which support present moment awareness with less sense of self and a greater feeling of being. Well, that's good. Okay, how about years of practice? People who, not perfectly, but as lay people, let's say, not monastics, are, pretty consistent, pretty like me, they've stuck with it over a number of years. Well, there tends to be increased thickening, a thickening of cortical tissue in several important parts of the brain. One part is in the prefrontal cortex, which supports the executive functions of planning and control. It gets thicker. Second major region in the insula. There are two insulae, one on either side of the brain, on the inside of the temporal lobes. And this is a very important part of the brain, the insula, because it's involved with self-awareness, as well as for empathy for the emotions of others. And so as we repeatedly, for example, regulate our attention, no wonder regions in the prefrontal cortex that are involved with that build up tissue. Neurons that fire together wire together. Same with the insula. As we repeatedly tune into our own bodies with mindfulness-oriented meditation that tends to have a strong element of it that's about awareness of the body, as we repeatedly tune into our body and tune into our gut feelings and become stably self-aware, we're working the muscle, as it were, of the insula, and so it tends to build up tissue there. And as we build up tissue in regions of the brain that perform certain functions, we get better at those functions. People who have a long-term meditative practice tend to be better at regulating their attention and their emotions and actions. They also tend to have greater self-awareness in terms of insula and also more empathy for others in different kinds of studies that aren't necessarily neurologically grounded. Also, the anterior cingulate cortex, this is the frontal portion, anterior, of the cingulate cortex. We spoke already of the rearward, posterior portions of the cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is involved with kind of the top-down regulation of attention, along with the prefrontal cortex. And the anterior cingulate cortex is especially helpful in acting like an internal monitor for when we wander off of our goals, when we're no longer staying on target. And so there you are with a wandering mind, meditating on the breath, shopping list, what do I need to get at the store, blah, blah, blah. Whoop, I've been wondering, I need to get back to the breath. The anterior cingulate helps you do that. So there too, as people repeatedly do that in meditative practices, they get better at being able to do that in ordinary life related to building up structure and function in the anterior cingulate cortex. Also, people who have a long-term practice tend to have thicker corpus callosum. This is funny names, right? This is a part of the brain between the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex that connects them, right hemisphere, left hemisphere. So people who repeatedly practice meditation over multiple years tend to have thicker tissue in the corpus callosum, and therefore they're more able, potentially, to have a greater integration of nonverbal activity and verbal activity, intuition and sequential logic. Pretty great. And over time, a key point as well, there's less cortical thinning due to aging in the prefrontal cortex and the insula. This speaks to the point that we normally lose brain cells as we age. We start out with nearly 200 billion or so, give or take, and estimates are still emerging about exactly how many cells there are in the brain. But, round numbers, ballpark, close to 200 billion. If we're losing a few thousand a day-ish, that's somewhat, but it's not horrible. Still, it leads to this process called cortical thinning with aging, which is associated with cognitive decline with aging, not Alzheimer's, not dementia, but, walking into a room and not remembering why you went there. I can tell you about that. So, with meditative practice, with repeatedly working parts of the brain, notably the prefrontal cortex and the insula, that are involved with the activities of meditation, what we're doing when we meditate, through repeatedly working those parts of the brain, we tend to preserve tissue there. And as we preserve cortical thickness in those parts of the brain, we tend to preserve their functions as well. We're using it, so we're not losing it. Good. And then this is an image that illustrates this point. I won't go into great detail about it. It just shows you the number 1 region is the insula, number 2, prefrontal cortex, and number 3, somatosensory cortex on the top of the head, a kind of a bit of a bonus benefit. And in the scatter plot at the bottom of the slide, you can see that the cortex measured in millimeters, which may not seem like much, but in a cubic millimeter, you could pack millions probably, certainly hundreds of thousands of little synapses, the connections between neurons. So something that changes on a scale of fractions of a millimeter even can make a big difference actually when added up, especially day after day after day after day. Small things can make a big difference when they accumulate over time. Well, you can see in the scatter plots at the bottom of the image that the red square non-meditators who were older had measurably, significantly thicker tissue in the 3 key regions measured here compared to the younger non-meditators, the younger red squares, and also the younger blue circle meditators. But you can see in the scatter plot that the older blue circle meditators had not lost cortical tissue in those key regions. As I said, they used it so they didn't lose it. That's really has interesting implications, especially for an aging population. And then, speaking of people who really are doing it a lot, people with a lifetime practice, mainly monastics, 10,000 or more hours. One of the really interesting research findings on them is that there are regions in the brain that get very active when we're anticipating a pain that we know is coming. But in their case, those parts of the brain were not active when they knew they were about to receive a mild but painful, let's say, electrical shock. And then after the shock occurred, they recovered to baseline extremely rapidly, unlike most of us who would still be rattled that we'd had to suffer that pain. That's a pretty significant neurological finding. Also, when the neural activity of really experienced lifetime practitioners is compared to people without that same kind of deep lifetime of practice, the lifetime practitioners have more gamma range brainwave activity. These are very fast, synchronized oscillations of many neurons across large parts of the brain 30 to 100 times a second. Can you imagine having a stadium full of people, 100,000 people, let's say, at a very, very large football stadium, all clapping together synchronously at more or less the exact same time, 50 times a second? Wow. Well, that's what's going on in your brain when it's generating gamma wave brainwave activity. And that very fast and distributed form of brainwave activity is associated with learning. And I think myself, it makes sense that it's also associated with a sense of integration and wholeness. Okay. Oof. In general, there's also a broad process that occurs over a long period of practice in which deliberate, sometimes effortful, top-down, willful regulation of ourselves, stay on the breath, stay on the breath. For example, it tends to quiet down and we develop more of a habit of meditative ways of being, so that actually inexperienced meditators, there can be less activity in key regions, such as the anterior cingulate cortex, because it's gotten more efficient, or other parts of the body-mind altogether are just more used to doing meditative practice. That's a broad and general finding. There's a lot of complexity here. And there's so much we don't know. In particular, what's going on in the brain during non-ordinary states of consciousness, such as these extraordinary non-dual experiences in which the sense of self just suddenly drops away, and the world, the universe, everything shines forth in radiant perfection. I've written about this in my book, Neurodharma, in terms of what is plausible, potentially, about what's happening in the brain during some of these deep, non-ordinary states of experience, including in non-ordinary states of consciousness known as the jhanas. This is the element, these are what comprise the element of wise concentration in the Buddhist Eightfold Path, including all the way out, potentially toward cessation and nibbana. This is very speculative territory. If it interests you, I've explored it to the best I can in my book, Neurodharma, and see if that interests you. But there's not much science here. That said, it is really pretty clear, summing up, that the science shows that with regular mindfulness practice, with regular mindfulness meditation practice, or mindfulness as an element of other forms of meditative practice, such as focusing on a mantra in transcendental meditation, or the intensive cultivation of loving kindness, or frankly, in my opinion, probably as well in many forms of contemplative practice that are prayerful, it seems clear that some of the major benefits of regular contemplative practice involving changes, durable, lasting changes in 4 networks or regions in the brain that are functionally involved with improved control of attention, better awareness of the body, better control of emotions, and an expanded sense of self. There's good science about that. And of course, there are probably other benefits as well that we don't yet have studies for. In the scientific saying, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And if there are durable changes of mind that are found in an individual or in a group of individuals who practice regularly certain kind of meditation, if there are durable changes of mind that are found, there must be durable changes in the body as well, most likely centered in the nervous system and its headquarters, the brain. What about some broader lessons here from studies on meditation for cultivation in general, developing in general durable personal qualities that are positive and useful? Well, consider the proverb, your mind takes its shape from what it rests upon repeatedly, sort of a bit like clay resting upon the shape of a particular object. Well, based on the recent science in the last 30, 40 years, especially the last 10 or 20, the modern update, based on what's been learned about experience-dependent neuroplasticity, that's a mouthful, your brain takes its shape from what your mind repeatedly rests upon, for better or worse. I'm focusing here on the better side, but it's also the case, certainly, that repeated painful, stressful experiences, particularly traumatic ones, can change the brain for the worse. So I want to fully acknowledge that while I focus here generally on changing the brain for the better. This process of change can take time. And I think of this teaching from the Tibetan sage Milarepa, who was looking back on his own life of practice. So we can apply what he's saying here to a life of practice, and we can apply it to the development of any particular thing, such as greater grit or gratitude, insight or compassion. As he said, in the beginning, nothing came. He wasn't able to experience what he was striving for. In the middle, nothing stayed. With deliberate effort or maybe external prompts, he was indeed able to experience certain things, such as while he was meditating or chanting or listening to a teaching. But it hadn't yet become a trait. It hadn't yet become woven into his nervous system and established in him stably. And then, as he says, in the end, nothing left. He had made that movement from states of mind to traits of being, hardwired in lasting ways into the living body. I love this particular statement from him. It's very hopeful. It means that we need to keep at it, even if in the beginning nothing comes, and we need to appreciate the transition from the middle to the end, from being able to have experiences and states, which are fairly easy to come by, that are not yet internalized to us as lasting traits. Even if what we do in our practice is to uncover the radiant true nature that was always already the case, even if we come home, in a sense, to who we've always been, there is still a gradual change process, an uncovering process in the heart-mind that depends upon underlying changes in the brain. In the broadest sense, in psychological terms, this is a process of learning. Social, emotional, somatic, attitudinal, even spiritual kinds of learning. Learning neuropsychologically, if we care about the change process, if we care about our practice having durable, lasting benefits, or if we care as teachers or therapists or clinicians of any kind, or parents or educators, if we care about lasting changes for the better, that means, I think, we should care about how learning occurs, including in the body, because if the body doesn't change in some way, there's no lasting learning. So learning proceeds in two states, already summarized in a little bit in the classic saying from the work of the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb, neurons that fire together wire together. There's the firing phase of encoding or activation or having a state, and then there's the wiring phase of consolidation, or what I call installation, the movement into a trait. And then in a wonderful upward spiral, as we move from states to traits, those growing traits foster experiences of them as states, which give us another opportunity for reinforcing them as a trait in that wonderful upward spiral. Key point: experiencing does not equal learning. Experiencing is relatively easy unless a person is deeply disturbed, deeply depressed. It's fairly straightforward to have one beneficial, useful, enjoyable experience or another. Pretty straightforward to evoke it in ourselves or to help other people have it. But activation, experiencing, without installation means there's no learning. It might be nice. It might be useful in the moment. The experience in this moment might foster an experience in that moment, which fosters an experience in that moment. Great, but it's all very fragile if there hasn't been the hardwiring of those experiences in some way as lasting trait-based changes in our own body. By definition, activation without installation, experiencing without learning, means there's no lasting healing, insight, growth in mindfulness and compassion, or release from craving. And it's very humbling for me as a longtime meditator, a longtime therapist, longtime parent, longtime teacher. What fraction of our hard-won beneficial experiences actually lead to lasting changes of neural structure and function? People tend to focus much more on activation than on installation. And unfortunately, this reduces the gains from any kind of mindfulness training, any kind of meditative practice, any kind of formal intervention like psychotherapy or counseling or coaching, human resources training, and also self-help activities. It's kind of startling when you start paying attention to the installation phase of learning, the internalization phase of learning again in the broadest sense. When you start paying attention to that second phase of internalization in lasting ways, you start to notice how usually it's just left out. There's some kind of presumption that if we just have experiences, something will stick to the walls and will change for the better in durable ways. But really? Not necessarily at all. In many simple ways, it's actually so easy to encourage the conversion from state to trait and thus steepen our personal growth curve and learning curve as we move through life. I've written about this at length. You can see the information about this freely offered on my website, rickhansen.net. I've also written about it in some depth in my book, Hardwiring Happiness, and you can find summaries in my other books as well. A lot of things to look at, but really, for me, I keep coming back to three go-tos again and again, one or more of these three. First, when you're experiencing something useful or enjoyable, something beneficial, stay with it for a breath or longer. Stay with it. Keep those neurons firing together so they wire together as well. Also, feel it in your body. As so many teachers have said, and so many therapists know, when we feel it in our body, that's when we tend to take it in. So feel it in your body. Slow it down and feel it in your body. And also focus on what's rewarding about it. As we heighten the sense of reward, of pleasure or meaning in an experience we're having, that increases the activity of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, particularly in the hippocampus. And when that occurs, when there's heightened activity of dopamine and norepinephrine, there's a kind of flagging of the experience we're having at the time as a keeper for protection and prioritization as it gets consolidated over days and even weeks into long-term storage. These are three ways you can immediately help yourself multiple times a day, and especially when something really matters, to deepen your lasting gains from the experience you're having rather than it just washing through you like water through a sieve. Learning is the strength of strengths because it's the one we use to grow the rest of them. And getting better at learning, knowing how to learn emotionally, somatically, motivationally, to learn the things that are important to you is, I think, the most important learning of all. This has wider implications. Everything I've said here, I think, has wider implications, and I want to talk about two of them. First, there's sometimes a fear that if we turn toward beneficial, wholesome experiences and rest our minds upon them, that will somehow foster clinging and craving. We'll get attached and greedy about those experiences. Yeah, that's a pitfall. Okay, watch out for the pit. But just because there are pits around a valuable trail doesn't mean we shouldn't keep walking. Walk the trail and avoid the pits. And in fact, the repeated cultivation of beneficial experiences reduces craving, certainly in biological terms, because craving biologically is a drive state based on an underlying sense of something missing, something wrong, an underlying sense of deficit or disturbance in the meeting of a core need, notably for safety, satisfaction, or connection, broadly stated, are three primary core needs in those of any animal. As we repeatedly internalize the beneficial experiences of needs met enough in the present, as we repeatedly internalize them, we develop a core, an inner core of peace, contentment, and love related to safety, satisfaction, and connection. And this core becomes increasingly unconditional because it's increasingly unrelated to or not contingent upon external conditions. resting in this growing, internalized, genuine sense, even amidst challenges, of it in the core, in the innermost temple of your being. This innermost sense of fullness and balance already reduces craving. In effect, it withdraws fuel from the fires of craving. Over time, the practice of cultivation itself tends to fall away because we've internalized. It tends to fall away like a raft in the traditional metaphor that is no longer needed once we reach the farther shore. Second major implication for our wider world. As we grow inner resources through internalization and through meditative practices in which we internalize the benefits of meditation, personally, we become more able to cope with stress, recover from trauma, and pursue our aims. And at the individual level, this is the foundation of resilient well-being. But what about at the political level? At the level of the 7.5 billion, soon 8 billion members of our one human tribe altogether. At the level of groups and countries, as people really do build up this sense of calm strength already, the sense of contentment and gratitude and satisfaction already, the sense of compassion and love and disengagement from ill will already. As individuals, growing numbers of individuals build these up as traits, well, people en masse, the public as a whole, can become increasingly less vulnerable to the classic manipulations of fear and anger for safety, greed and possessiveness in terms of our need for satisfaction, and us against them, rivalries and conflicts in terms of our needs for connection. This process has really important implications for our troubled world. And my own personal hope is that if an increasing number of people can rest in this sense of fullness and balance more continuously, that could help our planet come to a softer landing than the one it's heading toward. As I finish here, I'd like to comment, speaking of the last point, that we practice for others and we practice with others and we draw on others for our own practice, much as in the 4 monkeys in this picture. And I hope you can spot the 4th one, a little young monkey being protected by the 3 adults there. As we practice with the sense of being alongside others and for the sake of others, and with the felt sense of being supported by others, our own practice can deepen with rippling benefits that can spread out in ways known and unknown, seen and unseen throughout the entire world. And I just think that's one of the most wonderful potential benefits from having a personal meditative practice. Thank you.